Hey, I usually don't do videos like this, but let's give it a shot. I'm sorry if this kind of sucks. If you haven't been on that corner of the internet yet, and by that corner I mean a lot of the parts of the internet, something that has been going around for a bit is this thing called liminal spaces. Liminal spaces are often consistent of photos that are empty of any people and very low lit. It seems like something out of the back rooms, but a bit more fun-filled. A lot of these people claim that they've all been there before somehow, but we're not quite sure. And a lot of people say it's like a weird dream you had in your childhood, that nobody quite seems to know why exactly. But I have a few theories, or rather one big theory that all they tie into. Now, before I begin, I better just disclose I am not a psychologist, I'm not a doctor, I am just somebody who has an interest in mental health, but nothing that you wouldn't find for hours and hours and years of research on the internet. Now, according to the wiki, the aesthetic wiki, quote-unquote, liminal space is an aesthetic that refers to the feeling of being in a transitional space that has been abandoned, an airport at 4 a.m. or a school hallway in summer, for example. This makes us feel frozen and slightly unsettling. Going off of the I feel like I've been here in a dream before, some studies have shown that a good portion of our childhood was actually dreamed up, and we're not quite sure what we had dreams about versus what we remember when we were awake, and now most of us don't really remember most of our dreams unless you write them down, like I've started to, but there are a few dreams that seem to stick with anyone. Now, I will also mention there is this, foundation or something about the false dreams, but that has to do with people who claim that their kids who filed an abuse case against them were just dreaming all of it. So if you see that, I wouldn't really follow what they say. Now, most people who claim that they feel something from the photos are either from America or the UK or some other quote-unquote first world country. A lot of these photos come from similar time periods or were from buildings that were made in a similar time period and nothing past the last 50 years or so. In fact, the age group that responds the most to it seems to be late millennials and very early Gen Z. A lot of these places were actually chains like JCPenney or the Great American Cookie or something that we've seen before, but not quite stripped down and void of people and furniture. This goes into many different points. I will disclose that I have ADHD, which is probably why I'm making this video in the first place, because hyperfixation. So my dreams are very, very weird, but something that I've experienced that a lot of other people claim they've also experienced is that I'll have a dream where it's someplace that I've been before, but it's an altered reality. And it's not until I'm about to wake up, and maybe this is what causes me to wake up, that I realize, wait, something is off. But since you're dreaming, you kind of just accept it, like, okay, yes, this building that was normally 2 stories and very old is now 4 stories and has a bunch of new technology. For example, sometimes I'll dream I'm in one of my old schools, but my old schools were not funded that well and could barely afford a nice new couch. Now, how the heck would they be able to afford all these futuristic, more story additions to the thing? Additions? I don't know. So, maybe when you see those photos, it gives you both that nostalgic and fearful reaction. Because like in your dream, there's something familiar, but something is off. Something's not quite right. And as I've said before, a lot of people claim, oh, it's like a dream from your childhood. Maybe that's because the place is similar to a place you've been in your childhood, but not quite the exact place. It's like in your dream, except because you're not asleep, you notice it. You're already like, wait, something is wrong. When you're awake, you're pretty much aware that something is someplace it's not supposed to be. When you're asleep, you don't really care. Nostalgia gives you that comfort but sadness because it's a familiar place, and familiar things often make people feel more comfortable. Something unknown is quite the opposite for many. Another thing about these backrooms-esque photos is that they never have any people in them. Now, maybe with COVID, the time period where these photos have currently hit their popularity peak on the internet, it kind of added to that fear and isolation. For the past few generations, when you're a child, you're almost always accompanied by an adult or some kind of guardian. Even if they're not well within your reach, someone is watching you or at least knows where you are. With these rooms, there's nobody there. And since you haven't looked at it since childhood, you feel like a kid again. And it's like, oh wait, someone's supposed to be watching me. Why am I by myself? Why am I an adult now? Why am I independent? Or rather, forced independence. Why am I alone? There's someone there who's supposed to direct me where to go and care for me and tell me when it's time to leave. Then there are one of my favorite genres of liminal spaces. Abandoned malls. Not completely abandoned, like dirt on the ground, not taken care of, no lighting. I mean, something where, in my own words, it's kind of like a museum of a place that you were just a few years too young to really experience. It's like nostalgia, but also yearning for a place you've never been. Usually something that was built a few years before you can really remember anything, or before you were born. They still have that 80s or 90s type of architecture and interior design, but maybe there's only one or two stores still in that mall, like a food store or an eyeglass store that just won't give up the fight and won't sell for anything. And now they've got this whole empty mall that you can just walk through where the lighting is taken care of and the bathrooms are still there, but nothing else really to do. A lot of American malls are starting to close down, even before COVID hit, and now it's just twice as hard for them, unfortunately. People who walk through them feel a crazy amount of nostalgia and mainly sadness for what the place used to be. Very bustling and full of people, but now very cool and yet sad at the same time. A place that you wouldn't really be alone in unless you were dreaming or something terrible happened. There was actually a time where I went through a mall like this after there was a shooting scare. Except there were certain things like dolls or shoes or bags of clothing everywhere, but shortly after we had been told the area was clear and we went back inside. It was originally Christmas shopping level crowded and now nearly empty within minutes. People who didn't want to return there in fear maybe the cops made a mistake and there was still a shooter present inside. By the way, thankfully it was a false alarm and someone had been fighting and chairs were thrown and yeah, people thought there was a gunman inside. But with COVID and a lot of places are still closed and we just kind of think about those places that we currently have no one walking inside and well, maybe some of the lights are on and the air conditioning so nothing gets moldy, but other than the occasional cleaning staff, if that, there's really nobody there. If you do go in there, there's hopefully way less people, and it just feels very empty. Maybe for some, it means the world will keep turning without you, and that's a feeling we all have to accept and acknowledge. Now, don't get me wrong, people would still be sad if you died, though, but it's just a weird feeling of emptiness. Now, to summarize what I've said before, it's kind of the feeling of, oh, I've been here before, but not quite something like my childhood. But something has been altered. You know, memories fade, we don't remember exactly where we've seen it before. We don't even know if it's someplace we've personally been, or someplace we truly just dreamed about, or someplace we saw in maybe our family's Christmas card, or passed along a car ride and never went to, even though we really wanted to go. Something we vaguely remember and might never see again, except for these weird photos on the internet. So let's be honest, I'm pretty sure we've all had a dream at one point or another where we can just walk through an abandoned mall with our friends. At least as a kid we did. You know, just walk through it and see what it would be like if there were no rules and you could skateboard or run around and scream. I don't know, maybe I'm alone here, I'm probably not. Now on the topic of dead malls and the 1980s and 90s, for some people it's nostalgic because they lived through it, they remember what it was like, but for Gen Z, who seems to be the most interested in these photos, we're kind of grateful and envious that we weren't in that time period. In every generation, there's a mix of good and bad. A lot of people, myself included, wish we could just visit the time. Without changing the timeline, but just visit it and experience it. You know, people used to say, oh, I was dressed up in the wrong generation, but now because of COVID, we really wish we could go back. People would say, oh, you can still listen to old music, you can still go to a lot of these places, they're still open, you can always dress like it's from that time period, but because of COVID, we can't. And unless you were someone who had a severely chronic or debilitating illness, I'm not joking, there are definitely communities like that who a lot of people forget about, who can't leave their beds. Most of us were able to go outside, and now it's just very bizarre that we can't. Even before COVID, people who grew up around phones often say that they wish they had the freedom and ability that they don't anymore. Take Action Park, which maybe I'm only going off of because I watched a documentary on that last night and I know people who went there when they were in the 80s. There were seemingly no rules and you could do what you want, and on one hand that sounds really dumb because we want to come back from an amusement park without having any severe injuries and or death like many unfortunate patrons at the time came back with. But at the same time, we hear about those crazy parties and the wild things and being able to do whatever, and it's kind of making us jealous. We're so careful now that it just feels like, man, I want to go back to those wild and crazy times. But a lot of those wild and crazy times we hear about it were from survivors that left with a few scars and a bunch of funny memories. Other people will say the exact opposite. I'm not trying to bring politics into this, but I'm pretty sure if you asked a straight white guy what he felt about the 1980s, it's gonna be a bit different than a gay black woman would say. For those who can't tell by my accent, I'm from the USA, so I can't speak for other countries. As far as we are aware, we can only go forward and not back, kind of like a shark. And while we might look back on our childhood and maybe some of us are unfortunately very happy it's gone because of trauma, there's still things we want to go back to and visit old places and visit old times. The truth is, they say life gets harder. For some of us, that's not true, but for pretty much all of us, we get more responsibilities. We want to go back to a world where we didn't have to work full-time or pay taxes. And although I'm pretty sure if you told your younger self, oh, I miss school, your younger self would be like, what the heck, I hate it here. The value of things just goes up when we don't have them, down when we do, and back up when we lose them. Everything from a human who might annoy you to a time. Take it from someone who's way too appreciative in the sense that they fear losing things way too much. It's a blessing and a curse because you remember that everything is a gift and not a given right, but at the same time, you can't just enjoy things the way that other people can. You get too emotional. I'm sure plenty of people who actually experienced the 1980s were not as happy as they claim they were. We look back on our lives with such a joy. You're saying, oh, I had no idea how easy I had it. And in many cases, when it comes to childhood, that's true, but there were a lot of other stressors as a child, such as way less independence. You couldn't make your own decisions a good portion of the time, so if your parents or the people taking care of you were not very good, you probably didn't have the same childhood you wanted. Also, I am talking about American children, as I've said before. I cannot speak for children in other countries who probably would kill to have a childhood like any of ours, even if ours sucked booty. For some of us, the appeal of the 1980s was it seemed like they were the last quote-unquote free generation. But for any of us who weren't there, we only get to see it consumed in media. With the exception of news stories, the media tends to glamorize things that look like advertisements. And look at how happy people in advertisements are. I can guarantee you that nobody is almost that happy all the time in real life, especially period commercials. Why are they running around all happy and wearing white and free? No. Most people, myself included, the first day of our period are on our couches, grabbing our stomachs with a heating pack, going, why? I don't even want children yet. Why? But I'm sure that if someone who's never been to the 2010s are going to watch these and go, man, that time looks so cool. And not just because now there's a pandemic, but I'm sure it's always been like that. Your brain is hardwired to remember more bad memories than good, but when it's something you can never get back, it kind of changes. You tend to compensate or bargain or ignore it, like, yeah, there were some bad times, but I miss them. Another thing is when we look at the negative parts of that year, we already know how it resulted. For example, World War II, we already know America won that, but people living in that time had no idea. They had the same anxieties and fears that we do about things now, like COVID. Maybe in a few years the vaccine will work and it'll only last a little bit longer and then it'll all be okay. But for people with death anxiety especially, on which, by the way, I found out it peaks in your 20s, so if you're 20 like me and watching this and suddenly you're worried about what's going to happen to you after you die and you're questioning your faith and worried about your family members, especially if they are immune compromised, just so you know you are absolutely not alone. And a lot of people are suffering, but just don't want to bring it up because it's a hard topic to talk about, and since death is inevitable, distractions are kind of the easiest coping method for everyone. As I was saying before, we have no idea how COVID is going to end, if it's going to end at all. I'm pretty sure that if we were a person in that time, place, or period of something else that was terrifying, like a war or a nuclear threat, or something that was going on, we'd probably be freaked out too. But since we're from this generation who has only learned about it through history books, we tell ourselves, hey, it's not that bad, because we did not experience that loss and anxiety and fear the way that people did back then. When we talk about traveling back to the 1920s, we don't mean the pandemic, we don't mean the sexism and the racism, unless you do, in which case, dude, you need help. We mainly talk about exciting things that we don't get to experience nowadays. Listening to swing music without that much judgment and hearing it at a club. At the same time, I'm sure there are people from other generations that would kill to have what we have. Technology and penicillin. We have the ability to look up any type of video we want and most likely find it. We say we miss old technology, but believe me, you're probably one of those people who didn't contribute to keep it alive. You might complain about not being able to go to Blockbuster anymore, but do you really miss the technology and the time, or do you just miss the nostalgia? You know dang well that if you had two options, whether to leave your house and go to Blockbuster or to stay home and just stream a Netflix movie, you'd probably pick the Netflix option, unless you haven't been out of the house however long, such as right now because of COVID. We all love the convenience, and for some people, they might rely on it because of a disability. For some people, this world is the best they're going to live in because of the acceptance and the consideration. But for others, they miss being able to go out and do things rather than sit around and wait. And from some people I've heard, you still did get bored in the 1980s. That's why people acted so dumb. They were on drugs or bored out of their minds because they didn't have the internet or people to talk to. They would talk about calling up their friends, and sometimes we miss that, and we miss the sound of people's voices. But at the same time, we just want to be able to do independent things, and nothing has given us quite as much independence to learn as the internet. In fact, if it weren't for the internet, we might not look up all these similar images that give everyone from the US a similar feeling, even though we might be states away. We might never know that other people have crazy stories like us or have also experienced similar traumas to us unless we're going to group therapy. The internet, like most other things, is just another pro and con part of this generation. And who knows what's going to happen to it in a few years. A lot of people complain about the social justice of the internet and how people can post a photo or video and someone's life might get ruined, but other times it actually helps solve crimes, and there are a lot of people whose stories never got told until now. The point is, even if it's some sort of mall that Gen Z was not old enough to experience, it's not always nostalgia in the sense of yearning for a place we're never going to be able to see again. It's also yearning for a place that we're never going to be able to go. We're never going to be able to experience or stay unless we make a simulation like one of those old 1950s indoor towns that they put up to help people with Alzheimer's. We're never going to be able to experience things again because things always just keep moving forward. Unless we build a time machine, but then the whole butterfly effect, we might fuck up the future, you know. We can't really experience things we've already happened to experience. We just need to accept that things keep going forward and we move on. Honestly, I think that's a lesson that people spend a lifetime accepting. Take it from someone whose hyper-fixation is things like this. Another fear some people have is watching people with COVID now get brain fog. We're trying harder than ever to remember things, and for people who grew up with the internet, we often share every single detail or almost every single thought or detail that happens to us. Now, for many older generations, it's very annoying, but for us, it's kind of how we grew up. And every generation is annoyed with the next, and the next one is annoyed with the next. Assuming we all live to be 40 or so, we're going to be those gray-haired people screaming at the younger generation who we swear we are so much better than. And looking at some old videos taken by students of malls, it doesn't really seem like there's that much of a difference. There are still those weird teenage guys we'd probably shake your head at or join because they're goofing around and on the floor screaming. There's older folks entering stores that kind of unnerve them, like Hot Topic or Spencer's, and they realize that their grandkids are goth. There's some girls shopping with their friends and people working there who just want to get their money and go home. It kind of gives you that feeling that you realize everyone's life is just as complex and interesting as your own. Anyway, if you're into psychology, feel free to check out my true crime playlist, but as always, please be respectful to the victims. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe and follow me on Bigo where I talk about lots of stuff. Sorry if my speech wasn't the best. I kind of did this trying to get it out as fast as I possibly could. I know, quality over quantity, but my life is going to be a bit busy with the new year coming in.